On April 18, 1521, Charles V broke his word, and Martin Luther died in the flames before the month was out. The young emperor had summoned the Augustinian friar to the Diet of Worms under an imperial safe-conduct, the same kind of promise that should have guaranteed his return to Wittenberg untouched. But after Luther refused to recant on the evening of the 17th, and again on the 18th, declaring he would not act against conscience unless convinced by scripture or plain reason, the papal nuncio Girolamo Aleandro pressed his case relentlessly. A living Luther, he argued, was a fire that would not go out. Charles, who saw himself as the sworn guardian of the Catholic faith across Spain, the Low Countries, Austria, and the Americas, concluded that the danger of mercy outweighed the cost of a broken oath. He invoked the precedent of the Council of Constance, which had burned Jan Hus in 1415 despite a similar guarantee. Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, had planned to spirit his theologian away to Wartburg Castle. He never got the chance. Imperial guards seized Luther within the city, and the friar who had shaken Christendom was condemned and executed before any rescue could be staged. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. For decades, observers had assumed that ideas, once printed, could not be killed. What followed would test that assumption to its breaking point. A movement is not only a set of beliefs, it is a center of gravity, a person around whom others orient themselves, and at Worms that center was extinguished. Luther had posted his 95 Theses against the sale of indulgences in October 1517, burned the bull Exsurge Domine in December 1520, and been excommunicated by Decet Romanum Pontificem that January. His German pamphlets had already spread across the empire through the printing presses, reaching a wide lay audience hungry for reform. But the most consequential work was the work he never lived to do. There would be no German New Testament from Wartburg, no flood of accessible scripture bindings scattered congregations into one cause. Evangelical preaching survived, but only in isolated towns, each cut off from the others, each vulnerable on its own. Philip Melanchthon, the gifted young humanist who had been Luther's closest collaborator, was now a scholar without a champion. He softened his language. He chose ambiguity over confession, survival over confrontation, because the alternative was the stake. The grievances that had fed the movement did not vanish, but the thing that had made them dangerous, a shared voice, a translated text, a martyr who had not yet become one, was gone, and the cause began quietly to lose its shape. The anger was real, and it had been building for generations. Peasant economic distress, anti-clerical resentment, and a deep sense of grievance against landlords and prelates alike had simmered in the German lands long before any organized reformation. That fury still erupted. Across the countryside, men took up arms against tithes and dues and the petty tyrannies of local lords. Thomas Müntzer, a radical preacher of apocalyptic conviction, sought to give the risings a meaning larger than bread and land. But he had no common theology read in every village from a single trusted source, no movement that stretched coherently across the territories, no martyr's memory to unify the disparate bands. Each revolt remained regional, local, sealed off from the next. And so the princely armies dealt with them one at a time. A rising in one territory was crushed before word of it could inspire another. Without a banner that the whole land recognized, the rebels fought as isolated clusters of the desperate, and they were broken piecemeal. The economic pain endured. The political order did not, but the consequences of this fragmentation would reach further than anyone in those years could see. To understand how far, we must look south to the one place where reform still stood organized. Huldrych Zwingli had not needed Luther. From 1519, he had been preaching reform in Zurich on his own terms, drawing on the Erasmian humanism of the age rather than on Wittenberg, and his movement had its own roots, its own momentum, its own city. After Worms, Zurich became the last organized center of reform in all of Christendom. But a city is not an empire. Without a powerful German ally to draw imperial attention elsewhere, without a parallel movement pressing from the north, Zwingli's reform was contained within the Swiss cantons. The Catholic confederates surrounding Zurich held firm, and the pressure of an emperor no longer distracted by a German schism pressed steadily inward. The Swiss reform did not collapse, it simply stopped spreading. Boxed within its mountains and its alliances, it became a regional peculiarity rather than the seed of a continental transformation. And beyond the cantons, the Church faced no rival it could not manage. Rome had been frightened, but it had not been broken, and that distinction changed everything. With no rival church drawing souls and territories away, the Curia could afford to do what it had long resisted, take up the reformers' lesser complaints itself, on its own schedule, without the humiliation of surrender. The abuses that had given Luther his opening, the brazen sale of indulgences, the ignorance of parish clergy, the absentee bishops, were precisely the targets that thoughtful Catholics had been criticizing from within. Erasmus of Rotterdam had always argued for reform inside the Church rather than schism, and now the Erasmian voices found room to work. Indulgence abuses were curbed, clergy training improved. The grievances that had fed dissent were drained, slowly, from above. It was reform without rupture, correction without confession, and it accomplished something the rebels never could. It removed the reasons men had rallied to them in the first place. The ships that crossed the Atlantic and rounded Africa carried more than gold and ambition. They carried a confession, and now there was only one. Spanish and Portuguese missions advanced under a single catechism, with no competing Protestant maritime power to contest the New World along religious lines. In the timeline that was lost, rival faiths would one day plant rival colonies, and the map of the Americas and beyond would be carved partly along confessional seams. Here, no such fracture appeared. The expansion of Europe overseas proceeded under one church, its missions unchallenged by any Protestant rival fleet, its doctrine uncontested on the decks of trading empires. The faith that consolidated at home was the same faith that sailed outward, uniform from the cathedrals of Castile to the missions of distant coasts. Knowledge still advanced, but it advanced inside walls that had not been broken. Natural philosophy pressed forward as it always had, and Copernican ideas about the heavens circulated among the learned. But the terms of their reception were set by a confident church that faced no rival confession eager to weaponize science against it. In the timeline that vanished, competing faiths would sometimes test ideas in open contest, each confession watching the other, each claiming the authority of truth. Here, debate over the cosmos was governed from a single seat. Rome, unchallenged and therefore unafraid in some matters and rigid in others, decided how far inquiry might run and how fast. The new astronomy was neither crushed nor freed by competition. It was managed, and then came the absence that defined everything that followed. The fault lines never formed, and so the catastrophe never came. In the history we know, the confessional divide tore the Holy Roman Empire into armed camps and culminated in the 30 Years' War, a generation of slaughter, famine, and ruin that emptied whole regions of Central Europe. In this timeline, that war was never fought, because the division that caused it never hardened. There were no Protestant princes to league against a Catholic emperor, no religious frontier running through the German lands, no decades of armies marching across a continent in the name of rival creeds. Central Europe was spared. Towns that would have burned remained standing, populations that would have been halved endured, and political power consolidated, steadily and without the great religious wars, around a faith that no one was left to question. It is tempting to call this a kinder world, and in the ledger of lives unspent it may have been. But a faith never challenged is also a faith never refined by challenge, and a continent spared its agony is also a continent that never learned what that agony would have taught. The friar burned at Worms took more than his life to the pyre. He took the questions, and a world that never had to answer them became, in its quiet and unbroken way, a different world entirely.